The wind out here doesn't just blow, it screams. It tears at the exposed skin on your face like invisible razors, freezing the moisture in your eyes before you can even blink. I adjusted the strap of my rifle, feeling the cold bite through my gloves, and checked the GPS coordinates one last time. This was it. Sector 4. The place that didn't exist on any map printed after 1998. The entrance was buried under 6 feet of snow and ice, hidden beneath the skeletal remains of a collapsed transmission tower. It looked like a grave. Maybe it was. But I wasn't here to pay respects. I was here for answers. I pulled the heavy iron wheel of the bulkhead door, the metal groaning in protest against decades of rust and ice. With a screech that echoed across the empty tundra, the seal broke. A puff of stagnant, pressurized air hit me. It didn't smell like the clean, frozen air outside. It smelled of ozone, old copper, and something sweet. Something rotting. I clicked on my shoulder-mounted flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness, and descended into the throat of the beast. Welcome to Project Borealis. The steel ladder felt brittle under my boots, reverberating with a hollow clang every time I shifted my weight. 30 feet down. 40. The air grew warmer, dense with a humidity that shouldn't exist this far north. My boots hit the concrete floor with a heavy thud. I paused, holding my breath, straining my ears against the silence. But it wasn't silent. Not really. Somewhere deep in the complex, beneath the hum of failing backup generators, there was a sound. A wet, rhythmic slapping against the tile floor. Like wet meat hitting a butcher's block. Slap. Slap. Drag. I unslung my rifle, thumbing the safety off. The click sounded like a gunshot in the confined space. The hallway ahead was a throat of darkness, lined with thick cables that pulsed with faint, dying amber light. This was a biohazard level 4 containment zone, built to hold the worst nightmares humanity could cook up. And from the look of the blast doors ripped from their hinges up ahead, the nightmares had gotten out. I moved forward, sweeping the corners. Standard tactical entry, just like back in the sandbox, only the enemy here didn't care about politics or borders. They only cared about feeding. To my left, a shattered observation window revealed the lab. Papers were scattered everywhere, yellowed classified documents covered in a thick layer of dust and dried black fluid. Vials were smashed on the floor. I stepped over a corpse huddled in the corner. It was wearing a lab coat, or what was left of one. The skeletal hand was still clutching a clipboard, the knuckles white even in death. I knelt down, the fabric of my tactical pants crunching against the glass shards. I shone my light on the clipboard. The last entry was scrawled in erratic, panicked handwriting. Subject 9 shows no sign of necrotic decay. Regeneration is instantaneous. Hunger is insatiable. God help us. A noise down the hall made me snap my head up. The shuffling had stopped. Now there was a low, guttural chattering. It sounded like teeth clicking together rapidly. I stood up slowly, bringing the stock of the rifle tight against my shoulder. The smell of ozone spiked, mixed with the metallic tang of fresh blood. I wasn't alone. I crept toward the intersection of the corridors, the rubber soles of my boots rolling heel to toe to silence my approach. Shadows danced on the walls, stretched and distorted by the flickering emergency lights. I peeked around the corner. Standing there, facing away from me, was a figure. It wore the tattered remains of military fatigues. It was swaying, twitching violently every few seconds. I watched as its head snapped back at an unnatural angle, the vertebrae cracking loud enough to make me wince. It turned. The face was a ruin of scar tissue and exposed muscle, the jaw unhinged, hanging loose against the throat. But the eyes. The eyes were bright, glowing with a bioluminescent fungus that had taken root in the sockets. It saw me. It screamed, a high-pitched shriek that overloaded the audio on my tactical radio, and charged. I didn't hesitate. I squeezed the trigger. The suppressed shots were sharp hisses in the corridor, thwip, thwip. 2 to the chest, 1 to the head. The creature didn't drop. The impacts puffed dust from its uniform, tearing chunks of flesh, but it didn't slow down. It slammed into me, driving me back against the concrete wall. The rifle was pinned between us. I could smell its breath, rancid meat and chemical fire. I let go of the rifle with one hand and went for my knife. I drove the blade up, under the chin, into the brain stem. Black ichor sprayed over my face shield. The thing seized, convulsing against me before finally going limp. I shoved the heavy weight off me, gasping for air, wiping the sludge from my visor. 1 down. But as the echo of the scuffle faded, I heard it again. From every direction. From the vents above. From the floor grates below. The chattering. Hundreds of them. I checked my mag, 20 rounds left. I reloaded, the fresh magazine clicking into place with a reassuring mechanical snap. I wasn't just exploring a ruin anymore. I was hunting. And the prey was waking up. The hydraulic seal of the airlock groaned, a sound like a dying wail echoing through the desolation of the tundra, before giving way with a violent hiss of depressurization. For a moment, the differential between the outside blizzard and the stale, recycled air of the facility created a vortex, pulling a flurry of razor-sharp ice crystals into the vestibule. I slammed the manual override lever down, my heavy mittens slipping on the frost-rimed metal, until the blast door ground shut, severing the connection to the white void outside. Silence returned, heavy and oppressive, broken only by the ragged sound of my own breathing inside the insulated cowl of my parka. I checked the Geiger counter on my wrist, green. No radiation. Just the cold, and whatever was waiting for me in the dark. This was the Acer Borealis research station. According to the fragmented transmission I'd intercepted 3 weeks ago on the shortwave, this was where they had brought the original samples. Before the cities fell, before the firebombing of the coastlines, they thought the cold would kill it. They thought the pathogen X strain couldn't survive sub-zero temperatures. They were arrogant. I clicked on my tactical light, the beam cutting through the suspended dust motes, illuminating a reception area that looked less like a laboratory and more like a tomb. The reception desk was overturned, papers frozen into a solid papier-mâché block on the floor. I moved forward, boots crunching on shattered glass, my rifle raised. Scavenging is a discipline of details. You don't look at the room, you look at the shadows, the corners, the vents. My first priority was heat and power. The facility was running on emergency reserves, barely enough to keep the air scrubbers cycling. I vaulted the security turnstile, bypassing the biometric scanners that had long since lost their charge. Behind the desk, a corpse sat in a rolling chair, preserved perfectly by the ambient temperature of -20 degrees Celsius inside the complex. It wasn't a zombie. It was a security guard, a hole blown through the roof of his mouth, a frozen pistol grip still clutched in a rigor mortis hand. I pried the weapon loose, a high-caliber magnum, useless without ammo, but I took the half-empty box of rounds from his belt. I checked his pockets. A keycard, level 4 clearance. Jackpot. I wiped the frost from his name tag, LT Evans, and moved on. The guilt of looting the dead had evaporated months ago. Now, they were just containers for supplies. I pushed deeper into the facility, heading toward the medical wing. The hallways were lined with frosted reinforced glass. Through the panes, I could see the offices, abandoned in a panic. Coffee cups with mold circles frozen in time, chairs toppled, blood sprays that had turned black and hard like obsidian on the white walls. I needed antibiotics. The scratch on my leg from the scavenger run in Anchorage was festering, and the cold was making it sluggish to heal. I found the infirmary unlocked. The shelves had been ransacked, but the looters had been in a hurry. They missed the locked cabinets under the sinks. I used the butt of my rifle to shatter the lock. Inside, amoxicillin, high-grade painkillers, and a sealed pack of epinephrine. I dry swallowed 2 pain pills immediately, the bitter taste grounding me. That's when I saw the research log lying on the metal examination table. It was a ruggedized tablet, its battery indicator blinking red. I plugged it into my portable power bank, praying the cells hadn't burst. The screen flickered to life. The last entry was dated 6 months after the global collapse. I tapped play. The face of a woman, gaunt, eyes rimmed with red exhaustion, filled the screen. Dr. Eris Thorne. She was whispering. "It's not dying. It's slowing down," she said, her breath fogging the camera lens. "The necrosis stops at -10, but the viral replication doesn't. It crystallizes. It's replacing the host's water content with a biological antifreeze, a glucose-based polymer. They aren't rotting anymore. They are hardening. The skin becomes like Kevlar. We tried to burn them, but the outer shell, it insulates the nervous system. If you're seeing this, do not thaw the subjects. Repeat, do not thaw Sector 4. The screen died. I stood there in the silent infirmary, the implication settling in my gut like lead. The zombies out in the world were shambling bags of rot, falling apart as the seasons changed. But here? Evolution had been forced by the environment. The virus had engineered a way to survive the Ice Age. I should have turned back. I should have taken the meds and left. But greed is a survivor's worst vice. Sector 4 was where the prototype bioweapons were kept. That meant high-tech gear, maybe thermal optics, maybe localized power cells. I navigated the labyrinthine corridors towards Sector 4. The air got colder here, the frost on the walls growing into jagged spikes. The door to the containment wing was blasted open from the inside. Not prime marks, impact marks. Something with immense strength had punched through 3 inches of steel. I stepped through, my flashlight flickering as the temperature dropped further. The room was a cavernous warehouse of cylindrical glass tanks. Most were shattered. Fluid slicked the floor, frozen into a skating rink of hazardous waste. And then I saw them. The frost spiders. They didn't look like the ones in the city. They were huddled in the corners, or standing perfectly still in the center of the room. Their skin was a translucent pale blue, stretched tight over bone. Veins stood out like dark spiderwebs, but they weren't pumping blood. They were filled with that viscous black fluid Dr. Thorne had mentioned. Crystalline growths protruded from their shoulders and spines, jagged shards of ice and bone fused together. They looked like statues carved from nightmares. I moved silently, keeping my profile low. I spotted a hazmat locker at the far end of the room. I inched toward it, my boots wrapped in rags to dampen the sound. I was 10 feet away when the floor creaked. It wasn't a loud noise, just a metallic groan of shifting weight. But in the dead silence, it sounded like a gunshot. The nearest statue snapped its head toward me. The movement was instant, mechanical. There was no grogginess, no slow shambling acceleration. It saw the heat of my body. The virus had adapted their senses. Eyes clouded over with cataracts were useless, so they hunted by thermal gradients. It let out a sound that wasn't a moan. It was a high-pitched, chittering shriek, like ice cracking on a lake. It launched itself at me. I fired. The 5.56 round hit center mass, but instead of the wet thud of tearing flesh, there was a sharp crack. The bullet shattered against the frozen, hardened chest cavity, chipping off a chunk of the ice armor but failing to penetrate the vital organs. It hit me with the force of a truck, knocking the wind out of me and sending my rifle skittering across the ice. The cold radiating off it was intense, burning my skin through my layers. It clawed at my face. Its fingers were fused into solid hooks of bone and frost. I jammed my forearm up, blocking the strike, hearing the fabric of my parka tear. I kicked out, driving my boot into its knee. The joint didn't bend. It snapped with the sound of a dry branch breaking. The creature fell, but it didn't stop. It crawled, dragging its shattered leg, the black sludge leaking from the wound instantly freezing and acting as a sealant. It was repairing itself in real time. I scrambled back, grabbing a heavy canister of liquid nitrogen from a fallen cart. As the thing lunged again, jaws unhinging to reveal teeth made of jagged flint-like bone, I swung the canister. The steel cylinder connected with its skull. The impact reverberated up my arms. The creature's head didn't just cave in, it shattered. Fragments of frozen brain matter and skull sprayed across the floor like broken pottery. I didn't wait to see if the others were waking up. I could hear the shifting of weight, the chittering starting to rise in a chorus from the shadows. I sprinted for the hazmat locker, ripped it open, and grabbed a sealed hardened case marked thermal imaging/ballistics. I turned and ran. The run back to the airlock was a blur of adrenaline and terror. Behind me, the sound of sprinting footsteps, hard, rhythmic clacking against the metal floor, grew louder. They were fast. Much faster than the shamblers. They didn't tire. They didn't breathe. I threw myself into the airlock vestibule and slammed the internal release. The heavy door began to slide shut. A blue, clawed hand shot through the gap, gripping the edge of the door, the metal groaning under the pressure. I saw the face of one of them through the narrowing gap, eyes white and dead, face a mask of crystalline hatred. I unholstered the magnum I'd looted earlier, loaded a single round from the belt, and aimed at the fingers. Asterisk bang. Asterisk. The heavy slug decimated the hand, shattering the frozen digits. The creature shrieked, withdrawing the stump, and the door sealed with a final, heavy thud. I slumped against the wall, gasping for air, the condensation freezing on my beard. I looked at the case in my lap. I had the gear. I had the supplies. But I also had a new reality. The winter wasn't going to save us. The cold wasn't a sanctuary. The infection had weaponized the very thing we thought would kill it. I looked at the temperature gauge on the wall, -40 degrees Celsius. Outside, the blizzard howled, masking the screams of the things inside. I realized then that the tundra was no longer a wall against the dead. It was an incubator. The hydraulic seal hissed, a sound like a dying breath that had been held for 3 years. I watched the frost crack along the seam of the blast door, shards of ice falling like diamonds into the knee-deep snow at my boots. My hands, wrapped in 3 layers of scavenged wool and duct tape, trembled not just from the biting sub-zero wind of the tundra, but from the adrenaline spiking through my veins. This was it. The Chimera Outpost. Rumor on the shortwave radio, before the batteries died 2 weeks ago, claimed this was where the CDC tried to weaponize the cure, or at least, where they tried to understand what the virus was becoming. I pried the heavy steel door open just enough to squeeze through, the metal screeching against the rusted track. I slipped inside and shoved it shut behind me, plunging the airlock into darkness. I clicked my headlamp on. The beam cut through dead air that smelled of ozone, stale recycled oxygen, and the unmistakable copper tang of dried blood. It was warmer here, maybe just above freezing, but the silence was heavier than the wind outside. I checked my weapon, a battered Remington 870 with only 4 shells left in the tube. I had a crowbar on my hip and a combat knife strapped to my boot. Standard scavenger loadout, barely enough for a city run, let alone a high-security biolab. But I wasn't here to fight. I was here to loot. The airlock cycled manually, the inner door groaning open to reveal a reception area that looked like a slaughterhouse frozen in time. The emergency lights were dead, but my beam caught the glint of shattered glass and brass casings covering the floor. I moved low, stepping over the desiccated remains of a security guard. His uniform was shredded, the Kevlar vest torn open as if by a can opener. I knelt, my breath misting in the light, and patted him down. No ammo, but a keycard dangled from his belt. Level 4 clearance, Dr. Eris Thorne. I snagged it. Scavenging rule number 1. Access is everything. I moved deeper, past the reception and into the decontamination corridors. The walls here were lined with yellow hazard suits, hanging like ghosts in the gloom. I checked the pockets of a few, empty, save for a crumbled protein bar wrapper. My stomach growled, a painful reminder that I hadn't eaten in 2 days. I needed calories almost as much as I needed answers. The layout was a labyrinth of sterile white hallways, now smeared with grime and black mold. I found a break room on the left. The vending machine glass was smashed, the coils empty, but behind the counter, I struck gold. A box of instant coffee and a sealed tin of powdered milk. I shoved them into my pack, my fingers shaking. In the cupboard beneath the sink, I found a first aid kit. It had been picked over, the morphine gone, but a bottle of broad-spectrum antibiotics and a sealed pack of sutures remained. I took them. Infection killed just as often as the teeth did. I pushed toward the primary labs, the silence unnerving me. Where were they? A facility this size shouldn't be empty. The dead don't just leave. I found the answer in Lab 3B. The door was barricaded from the outside with heavy filing cabinets and an overturned desk. I squeezed through a gap near the ceiling, dropping down into the room. The smell hit me instantly, preservation fluid and rot. The lab was filled with glass cylindrical tanks. Most were shattered, but 3 remained intact. I approached the nearest tank and wiped the condensation from the glass. I recoiled, my heart hammering against my ribs. Floating inside was a subject, but it wasn't like the shamblers I'd fought in the cities. This thing had changed. Its skin was translucent, pulling tight over bones that looked thickened, calcified. Sharp protrusions jutted from its elbows and knuckles, natural bone spurs evolved into weapons. I turned to the lab benches, sweeping my light over scattered papers. I found a logbook, open to a page dated 6 months after the fall. The handwriting was erratic, frantic. Entry 412, the cryostasis failure didn't kill the specimens. It catalyzed them. The hemorrhagic fury virus adapts to environmental stress. In the extreme cold, the virus isn't slowing down, it's hardening the host. We're seeing dermal calcification. The skin is becoming armor. The metabolic rate drops to near zero, simulating death, until prey is within thermal range. They are ambush predators now. They don't chase, they wait. I froze. The silence of the facility suddenly took on a sinister weight. Asterisk, they don't chase, they wait. Asterisk. I slowly swung my light away from the logbook, sweeping the corners of the room. In the far corner, a pile of lab coats and debris sat motionless. I hadn't checked it. I'd assumed it was trash. My light caught a glint of wetness in the pile. An eye. Milky white, unblinking, staring right at me. The pile shifted. It didn't groan. It clicked. A sound like ice cracking on a frozen lake. I didn't hesitate. I racked the shotgun and fired. The roar of the 12-gauge was deafening in the confined space. The buckshot hit the mass, but instead of the wet thud of tearing flesh, I heard a crack like striking stone. The creature launched itself at me, moving with terrifying speed for something that had been dormant. It wasn't a clumsy shamble. It was a spring-loaded lunge. I dived to the side, crashing into a lab stool. The thing slammed into the wall where I had been standing, its bone-spurred fist punching through the drywall. I scrambled back, bringing the gun up. The beam of my light played over it, gray, rock-like skin, no lips, just exposed teeth and gums hardened into a permanent snarl. It hissed, steam venting from its nostrils. I fired again, aiming for the head. The shot took half its jaw off, shattering the calcified armor. It staggered but didn't drop. Scavenging rule number 2: don't waste ammo on a sponge. I needed to sever the spine or destroy the brain stem. It lunged again. I swung the shotgun like a bat, the stock connecting with its temple. It fell back, clicking furiously. I dropped the gun, too slow, and drew the crowbar. As it tried to rise, I drove the pointed end of the crowbar down into the ocular cavity, putting my entire body weight behind the thrust. There was a sickening crunch, then a squelch, and the thing went limp. I stood there, gasping, my breath coming in ragged clouds. I yanked the crowbar free, wiping the black sludge on my pants. I grabbed my shotgun and checked the chamber. 2 shells left. I went back to the logbook, ripping the pages out and stuffing them into my jacket. This intel was worth more than the food. The virus was evolving. The cold wasn't a sanctuary, it was a crucible. If these things migrated south when the thaw came, the survivor colonies wouldn't stand a chance against armored, ambushed predator zombies. I left the lab, my senses dialed up to 11. Every shadow looked like a crouching monster. I needed to get to the lower levels. The research logs mentioned a viral inhibitor prototype in cold storage. If I could find that, I could trade it for a year's worth of supplies, or maybe, just maybe, use it. The stairwell was blocked by debris, so I rappelled down the elevator shaft using a cable I looted from a winch in the maintenance closet. I landed on the roof of the elevator car at level B2, cold storage. I pried the hatch open and dropped in. This level was freezing. The backup generators must have been prioritizing the containment units here. Frost coated the floor. I moved silently, checking the rooms. Maintenance. Server room. Armory. The armory door was locked, electronic maglock. I swiped Dr. Thorne's card. The light turned green. A rush of relief hit me. I stepped inside. The racks were mostly picked clean, likely by the security team during the initial outbreak, but on a bottom shelf, I found a sealed crate. I pried it open with the crowbar. Inside were thermal flares and 3 boxes of high-velocity armor-piercing rounds. 56 millimeters. Useless for my shotgun, but currency in the wasteland. I packed them. Then, in the back, a locked pistol case. I smashed the lock. A pristine Sig Sauer P226 and 2 magazines. I checked the action. Smooth. I holstered it. A backup for the backup. I moved to the main cold storage vault. The door was massive, a circular bank vault style. It was slightly ajar. Bad sign. I slipped inside. The room was lined with stainless steel drawers like a morgue. Most were pulled open empty. But at the far end, a stand-alone biosafe hummed with power. I approached it. Through the thick glass, I saw a single vial of blue liquid suspended in a stasis field. The label read, *V inhibitor, strain Delta. *. I reached for the handle, but stopped. Reflected in the glass of the biosafe, I saw movement behind me. Not one. 6. They were peeling themselves off the ceiling and the upper walls. They had been clinging there, blending in with the pipes and frost, their calcified skin mimicking the industrial texture of the room. They had been waiting for me to get to the trap. The clicking started. A chorus of cracking knuckles and shifting bone. I didn't turn around immediately. I grabbed a thermal flare from my pack, ripped the cap off, and struck it. It ignited with a blinding red brilliance, sizzling with intense heat. I spun around, throwing the flare into the center of the room. The sudden heat and blinding light sent them into a frenzy. Their evolution had made them sensitive to thermal signatures. They shrieked, shielding their eyes, confused by the overload. I utilized the chaos. I grabbed the vial, shoved it into my padded case, and sprinted for the door. One of the creatures swiped at me blindly, its claws tearing through my backpack, shredding the box of powdered milk. White dust exploded into the air, mixing with the red smoke of the flare. I hit the corridor, my boots sliding on the frost. I didn't look back. I could hear them scrambling after me, the heavy thud of their armored bodies against the metal floor. They were fast. Faster than me. I made it to the elevator shaft. I didn't have time to climb. I hooked my arm around the cable and jumped, sliding down into the darkness toward the sub-basement sewer access. The friction burning through my gloves. As I fell, I looked up. Silhouetted against the red glow of the flare above, 3 of them dived into the shaft after me, diving headfirst. Their bone spurs scraping sparks against the rails. The hunt was on. The hiss of the hydraulic seal breaking was the only sound in the world, a sharp, pneumatic gas that cut through the howling wind outside before the heavy blast door thudded shut behind me. Silence rushed in to fill the void, pressing against my eardrums with a physical weight. I stood in the decontamination airlock of the Borealis research station, the condensation on my visor beginning to freeze into intricate, fern-like patterns. I wasn't just shivering from the 30 below temperatures of the tundra. The air inside tasted of copper, stale ozone, and something sweeter, the cloying, distinct scent of biological decay that had been preserved, rather than purged, by the cold. My Geiger counter clicked once, lazily, a reassuring rhythm in the tomb-like quiet. I stripped off the outer layer of my thermal gloves, my fingers stiff and clumsy as I fumbled with the flashlight mounted on my carbine. The beam cut a stark, trembling cone through the darkness, illuminating a reception area that had been frozen in time since the evacuation order that clearly never came. Scavenging is an art form born of desperation, but in a place like this, it felt more like archaeology. I moved methodically, boots crunching on shattered glass and spilled paperwork that had stiffened into papier-mâché sculptures on the linoleum floor. The lobby was a graveyard of intent. Suitcases were piled by the exit, bursting with clothes that would never be worn again. But I wasn't here for clothes. I'd bypassed the reception desk, vaulting over the turnstiles. My mission was calorie density and information. The facility schematics I'd pulled from a dead corporal 3 miles back indicated the cafeteria and the primary labs were on level B2. I took the stairs. Elevators in the apocalypse are just steel coffins waiting to trap you. On the landing of the first sublevel, I found the first body. It wasn't one of them. It was a scientist, lab coat pristine save for the single, jagged exit wound at the back of the skull. A suicide, precise and clinical. Beside him lay a shattered vial. I knelt, shining my light on the residue. It hadn't dried. It had gelled. I scraped a sample into a test tube from my kit. This was the first sign that the infection here was different. In the cities, the virus burned through hosts, turning them into rage-fueled sprinters that rotted within weeks. Here, in the cryo-freeze of the north, the pathogen didn't burn, it brooded. It adapted. I checked the scientist's pockets, scoring a keycard with clearance-level vermilion and a half-eaten pack of energy bars that I devoured instantly. Ignoring the stale taste of chocolate and sawdust. Level B2 was where the facility's heart had stopped beating. The emergency lights were still running on some deep geothermal backup, bathing the corridor in a rhythmic, pulsing red gloom. The shadows seemed to stretch and contract with the light, playing tricks on my sleep-deprived mind. I moved toward the labs, my weapon raised. The scavenging here was rich. I found a break room that hadn't been looted. 2 boxes of MREs, beef stew and vegetable cracker variants, went into my pack. A jackpot. Then, a first aid station on the wall yielded sealed antibiotics and a pristine trauma kit. I was shoving a box of sterile gauze into my webbing when I heard it. A wet, sliding sound. Like raw meat being dragged across tile. I froze, killing my light. In the red strobe of the emergency system, I saw movement at the far end of the hall. It was a silhouette, bulky and misshapen. It didn't shamble. It glided. I pressed myself into an alcove, holding my breath until my lungs burned. The thing passed by the doorway. It was a host, or it had been once. But the Arctic strain had changed it. The skin was no longer necrotic and peeling. It had hardened into a gray, chitinous shell, an exoskeletal reaction to the freezing temperatures. Spikes of bone pushed through the shoulders and forearms, natural armor and weaponry combined. It was evolution in fast forward. The virus had realized the host was fragile in the cold, so it reinforced the structure. It wasn't rotting, it was calcifying. Once the heavy footsteps faded, I slipped into the main lab, locking the mag seal behind me. The room was a labyrinth of centrifuges, mass spectrometers, and containment units. This was the gold mine. I wasn't just looking for supplies. I was looking for the why. I booted up a terminal, bypassing the encryption with the dead scientist's keycard. The screen flickered to life, bathing my face in green code. I accessed the logs, scrolling past the mundane daily reports until I hit the entry dated 2 days after the global outbreak. Dr. Eris Thorne's log. I hit play. The audio crackled, a voice trembling with a mix of terror and scientific awe. Subject 82 shows no signs of cellular apoptosis despite zero metabolic intake. The hemlock strain has bonded with the host's lipids. It's creating a natural antifreeze. a glycol-based secretion that replaces the blood. They don't freeze. They enter a state of suspended animation, but their sensory input remains active. They are waiting. And the cold, it makes them smarter. The hive instinct is amplified. We thought the winter would save us. We were wrong. The winter is preserving them. I downloaded everything. Terabytes of genomic sequencing, viral behavior models, weak point analysis. This drive was worth more than all the gold in Fort Knox. As the download bar crawled toward completion, I scanned the room. In the back, a row of reinforced glass cells held the test subjects. Most were empty, the glass shattered from the inside. One was intact. Inside, a creature sat huddled in the corner. It looked almost human, save for the crystalline growth erupting from its spine and the way its skin shimmered like frost. It was dormant. I moved closer, driven by a fatal curiosity. The plaque read, Subject 99. Strain variant, cryostasis. I needed a sample. It was suicide, but if the resistance back south was going to fight these things when the winter migration started, they needed tissue. I prepped a syringe gun, stepping up to the bioport on the glass. I inserted the needle. The hiss of the pneumatic seal was loud. Too loud. The creature's head snapped up. Its eyes were gone, replaced by multifaceted, crystalline structures that refracted the red emergency light. It didn't scream. It emitted a low-frequency thrum that vibrated in my teeth. The glass before me began to fracture, spiderweb cracks blooming from the center. Download complete, the computer chirped. I grabbed the drive just as the containment unit exploded. Shards of reinforced glass sprayed the lab like shrapnel. I took a piece of debris to the shoulder, the Kevlar holding but the impact bruising deep. The subject launched itself at me. It was fast, faster than the ones in the city. The cold didn't slow it down, it lubricated the joints. I rolled under a lab table, coming up with my carbine leveled. I fired a 3-round burst into its center mass. The bullets sparked off the gray, calcified chest. It didn't even flinch. It backhanded me, sending me flying across the room into a rack of chemicals. The pain was blinding, a white-hot flare in my ribcage. I scrambled up, grabbing a heavy glass beaker of hydrochloric acid from the shattered rack. The creature lunged, its bone-spiked arm aiming for my throat. I ducked, smashing the beaker against its face. The acid sizzled, eating into the crystalline eyes and the gray flesh beneath. It shrieked then, a sound like grinding metal. While it thrashed, blinded and confused, I saw my opening. The liquid nitrogen tank used for sample preservation stood near the door. It was a gamble. A desperate, stupid gamble. I sprinted for the tank, the creature hearing my movement and blindly swiping the air, its claws tearing through steel tables like wet paper. I reached the tank and kicked the valve off with my heavy boot. A cloud of supercooled vapor erupted, engulfing the room in an instant whiteout. I dove into the airlock, slamming the manual override. Through the thick glass of the viewport I watched. The nitrogen cloud hit the creature. The rapid temperature drop clashed with the antifreeze in its veins. It slowed, the fluid movements becoming jerky. The antifreeze was failing against absolute zero, It took a step toward me, arm raised, and then simply stopped. It solidified, turning into a statue of gray ice and hatred. I collapsed against the airlock door, gasping for air that didn't smell of acid and fear. I checked the drive in my pocket. Safe. I checked my body. Bruised, bleeding, but not bitten. I grabbed a spare parka from a locker near the exit, one with the facility's logo on the breast, and wrapped it around my battered frame. I had the data. I had the food. And I had the terrifying knowledge that the spring thaw wouldn't bring safety. It would bring them. The horde wasn't dead. It was just waiting for the temperature to rise. I cycled the airlock, stepping back out into the screaming tundra wind. The cold felt different now. It wasn't an enemy anymore. It was the only cage holding the monsters back. The wind didn't just howl across the tundra. It shrieked, a constant, physical assault that tried to scour the flesh from my bones. But the structure ahead wasn't natural. It was a concrete scar in the ice, a brutalist monolith half buried by distinct, unnatural drifts. The faded signage was barely legible under layers of frost, but the biohazard symbol, that distinct, three-pronged warning, was etched into the steel blast doors like a brand. Getting in wasn't about finesse. It was about brute forcing a hydraulic override panel that had been frozen shut for a decade. When the gears finally ground into motion, screaming against the ice, the sound was deafening, echoing out into the empty white waste. I slipped through the gap before the hydraulics failed, the heavy door slamming shut behind me with a finality that made my heart stutter. Silence. The sudden absence of the wind was more jarring than the noise. The air inside was stale, smelling of ozone, copper, and something sharp, like ammonia. My breath plumed before me in the beam of my tactical light. Emergency power was dead, but the thermal insulation held. It was freezing, but not the lethal sub-zero of the outside. I wasn't just here for shelter. I was here for the loot. High-level research labs meant high-level supplies, broad-spectrum antibiotics, adrenaline, perhaps even viable hydroponic seeds. I moved into the decontamination vestibule, sweeping the corners with my carbine. The floor was littered with discarded hazmat suits, looking like shed skins of synthetic snakes. I checked the pockets of a lab coat draped over a overturned gurney. Jackpot. A jagged, heavy keycard and a pristine blister pack of water purification tablets. I dry swallowed the reality of my situation. If the staff died here, they didn't die from the cold. The inner airlock opened with a hiss of escaping pressure, revealing the facility's spine, a long, central corridor lined with reinforced glass. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom, illuminating the devastation. This wasn't a panic evacuation. This was a slaughter. But the bodies. They were wrong. In the cities, the dead rot. They bloat, they liquefy, they crumble. Here, the bodies were preserved, desiccated. I knelt by a corpse in security armor. The flesh hadn't grayed, it had turned a translucent, bruised violet. I reached for the P-90 submachine gun strapped to the corpse's chest, a rare find, heavy with a full magazine. As I pulled the strap, the body's skin crackled. It wasn't frozen cloth. The skin itself had hardened into a chitinous shell. I pulled my hand back, examining the texture. The virus. It hadn't just reanimated them, it had adapted to the extreme environment. Without the heat to fester, the pathogen had fortified the host, turning the epidermis into a crystalline armor to protect the nervous system. I took the gun, checking the action. Smooth. I moved deeper, towards the cold storage and pathology wings. The scavenging was rich. I filled my pack with sealed MREs that had been chemically stabilized for long-term storage, a thermal optic sight, and a box of sterile bandages. But the prize was in the lab. I bypassed the cafeteria. Never go into the cafeteria. That's where the herds gather, and sliced the keycard through the reader of Containment Sector 4. The door slid open. The smell hit me instantly. Not rot. Chemicals. Formaldehyde and something sweet, like overripe fruit. The lab was a wreck of shattered glass and overturned centrifuges. I stepped over a shattered microscope, my boots crunching on slides. On the central workbench, a terminal blinked with a low battery warning. Running off a backup generator that must have been nuclear or geothermal to last this long. I ignored it for the moment, my eyes drawn to the sample cooler. I cracked the seal. Vials of blue liquid. Antivirals? Or the source? I grabbed 3, wrapping them in padded cloth. That's when I saw the logbook lying open next to a severed hand. I shouldn't have read it. The handwriting devolved from clinical precision to jagged panic. Subject 88 shows no sign of cellular decay at -40°C. Instead, the pathogen is synthesizing a glycerol-based compound in the blood. Natural antifreeze. It's not slowing them down. It's making them faster. The crystallization of the dermis makes them impervious to small arms fire. We are not containing a plague. We are incubating a new apex predator. A sound from the corner of the room froze me. It wasn't a moan. It was a clicking sound, like ice cracking in a thawing lake. I swung the light. In the corner, huddled beneath a smashed fume hood, was a shape. It was wearing a shredded lab coat, but the body underneath was a monstrosity of evolution. Spikes of bluish ice, no, not ice, bone and crystal, protruded from its shoulders and spine. The head was encased in a translucent helmet of callus and frozen fluid. It stood up. The movement was jerky, mechanical, but terrifyingly fast. I raised the P90. The creature let out a shriek that sounded like grinding metal and lunged. I squeezed the trigger. The tight spray of 5.7 rounds slammed into the creature's chest. In the city, that burst would have turned a walker into mulch. Here sparks flew. The bullets shattered against the crystallized chest plate, ricocheting dangerously around the lab. The creature didn't even stumble. It closed the distance in a blur. I threw myself to the right, crashing into a rack of test tubes. The creature's claw, elongated fingers fused into a serrated blade of bone, slammed into the metal table where I had been standing, shearing through the steel like it was wet cardboard. I scrambled back, my boots slipping on the slick floor. The logbook. Fire. They hated heat. I grabbed a Bunsen burner from the debris, twisting the valve, and sparked my lighter. The blue flame hissed to life. The creature recoiled, screeching, shielding its eyes. The heat didn't burn it, it destabilized the crystal armor. I saw the chest plate dripping, turning slushy. I didn't wait. I grabbed a beaker of ethanol from the shelf and hurled it at the thing, following it with the open flame. The lab erupted in a flash of blue and orange. The creature wailed, a sound so high-pitched my vision blurred. The fire melted the armor, exposing the raw, violet meat beneath. I raised the P90 again, aiming for the softening skull. Asterisk thwip thwip thwip. Asterisk the rounds punched through the slushy exterior. The creature dropped, twitching, black ichor pooling around it, blood so thick it looked like tar. I didn't stick around to see if it would get back up. The noise would draw others. The evolution was clear. The cold didn't kill the virus, it refined it. It stripped away the weakness of rotting flesh and replaced it with the efficiency of a machine. I grabbed my pack, the straps digging into my shoulders, and sprinted back toward the airlock. The hallway seemed longer now, the shadows stretching. I could hear them waking up behind the walls, the rhythmic click-click-click of crystalline joints flexing after years of dormancy. I hit the airlock release. The hydraulics screamed again. I tumbled out into the snow, the freezing wind hitting me like a physical blow. I scrambled away from the door as it sealed, collapsing into a snowdrift. I checked the loot. The meds, the ammo, the vials. I had what I needed to survive another week, maybe two. But as I looked back at the concrete bunker, I realized the terrifying truth. The tundra wasn't a prison for them. It was a fortress. And if the thaw ever came, if that ice ever melted and those things marched south, there wouldn't be anything left to scavenge. The wind didn't just howl, it screamed, a constant, physical weight pressing against the thermal layers of my suit. Visibility was near zero, a white void of churning snow that erased the horizon, but I knew the structure was there. I had seen the jagged, unnatural silhouette of the concrete block cut through the storm moments before the whiteout descended. This was it. The elusive Sector 4 outpost. Rumors whispered over dying radio frequencies claimed this place had gone dark before the major panic. Meaning it hadn't been picked clean by the desperate masses fleeing the cities. It was a tomb, yes, but a tomb full of resources. My fingers, stiff even inside heated gloves, fumbled with the magnetic lock of the outer airlock. The keypad was dead, frosted over with an inch of rime ice. I didn't bother with finesse. I jammed the pry bar into the seam of the heavy blast door and leaned my entire body weight against it. For a moment, nothing happened, just the groan of metal straining against the deep freeze. And then, with a screech that tore through the howling wind, the seal broke. The pressure differential popped my ears as the heavy steel swung inward. I slipped inside and hauled the door shut, spinning the manual wheel until the locking mechanisms clanked home. The silence that followed was heavy, pressing against my eardrums. It wasn't empty silence. It was the suffocating quiet of a place that had held its breath for years. I clicked on my shoulder lamp. The beam cut through the stagnant, dust-mote-filled air, illuminating a decontamination chamber. Yellow hazmat suits hung on hooks like shed skins, swaying slightly from the draft I'd let in. I bypassed them. My gear was better. What I needed was calories and ammunition. The inner door yielded to a keycard I'd scavenged from a frozen corpse 3 miles back. Poor bastard never made it to the shelter he held the keys. 4. The facility was a labyrinth of brushed steel and flickering emergency LEDs that had somehow survived on auxiliary geothermal power. I moved with the practiced, rolling gait of a scavenger, quiet, low, weapon raised. The first room of value was the cafeteria. It was a chaotic freeze frame of the outbreak's beginning. Trays were scattered, chairs overturned. But the pantry was the holy grail. I felt a surge of dopamine that was almost dizzying as I swept the beam over the shelves. Vacuum-sealed bulk rice, dehydrated vegetables, and miraculously, crates of military-grade MREs. I didn't gorge myself. Discipline is the only thing that separates the survivors from the walkers. I packed my rucksack methodically, placing the densest calorie items at the bottom to center the weight. I found a box of protein bars, chocolate peanut butter, and shoved one into my mouth, the taste of artificial sugar bringing tears to my eyes. This alone was worth the trek through the tundra. But I wasn't just here for food. I needed to understand why the radio chatter about this place had sounded so terrified. Moving deeper, the architecture shifted from utilitarian to clinical. Biocontainment. The air got colder here, unrelated to the weather outside. The walls were lined with observation windows looking into sterile clean rooms. It was in the third lab that I found the first anomaly. A corpse strapped to a gurney. I approached cautiously, my rifle barrel trained on the head. Standard protocol says the infected rot, or they desiccate. This one had done neither. The skin was translucent, stretched taut over bone, but beneath the dermis, the veins weren't black with necrosis. They were bright, iridescent blue. I leaned in, holding my breath. The tissue hadn't decayed, it had calcified. I began rifling through the desk drawers, ignoring the gruesome tableau on the table. I found a leather-bound logbook, the handwriting frantic. Day 40. The pathogen doesn't die in the cold. We were wrong. God, we were so wrong. It adapts. The cryostasis didn't halt the replication, it forced a mutation. The viral structure is mimicking the crystalline lattice of ice. It's fortifying the host. I flipped the pages, my heart hammering against my ribs. Day 52, subjects require 0 caloric intake. They are drawing thermal energy from the environment. They are heat sinks. If you get close, you freeze before they even bite you. I looked back at the body on the gurney. The iridescent blue veins seemed to pulse in the strobe of my flashlight. Scavenging took a back seat to intelligence gathering now. I grabbed a localized hard drive from the terminal, ripping the cords out. I needed to get this data back to the Enclave. As I turned to leave, a sound echoed from the corridor, a sound like cracking ice on a frozen lake. Asterisk crack. Shift. Crack. Asterisk I froze. The sound wasn't coming from the pipes. It was coming from the observation room next door. I shone my light through the reinforced glass. Inside, a dozen figures were standing. They weren't shambling. They were perfectly still, statues of pale blue flesh and frost. They were huddled together in a tight circle. As the beam of my light hit them, they didn't scream. They turned, all at once, with mechanical precision. Their eyes were gone, replaced by jagged, milky crystals jutting from the sockets. The ice walkers. The logbook hadn't done them justice. One of them stepped forward, and the glass between us began to fog, then frost over rapidly. The creature placed a hand on the window. The reinforced polycarbonate groaned. Fractures spider-webbed out from its palm. They weren't just strong, they were freezing the barrier to make it brittle. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in my chest. I bolted. Scavenging mode off. Survival mode on. I sprinted back the way I came, my heavy pack bouncing against my spine. Behind me, the sound of shattering glass erupted like a gunshot. The screech of the infected wasn't the guttural wet roar of the city zombies. It was a high-pitched, resonant shriek, like metal grinding on metal. I took a corner too fast, my boots skidding on the linoleum. I slammed into the wall, recovered, and kept running. The temperature in the hallway was dropping rapidly. I could feel the chill seeping through my thermal suit. They were sucking the heat out of the air. I reached the atrium leading to the airlock. I spun around, raising my rifle. The first one burst from the shadows of the corridor. It moved with terrifying speed, not the lurching stumble of the dead, but a jerky, rapid sprint. I fired. The 5.56 round hit its center mass. It didn't splash blood. It shattered the chest cavity like a dropped vase. Chunks of frozen, blue meat sprayed the floor, but the thing kept coming, its structural integrity compromised but its drive relentless. I aimed for the head. The second shot connected, exploding the crystalline growth in its skull. It dropped, shattering into pieces upon impact with the floor. But there were more. A dozen more. Their shrieks filled the atrium, vibrating in my teeth. I fumbled for a flare on my belt. Heat. The log said they were heat sinks. If they absorbed too much, too fast, maybe they'd overload. I cracked the road flare and threw it into the center of the room. The crimson light bathed the sterile white walls in blood-red hues. The creatures recoiled, screeching as the intense heat source disrupted their senses. One of them lunged at the flare, and the moment it touched the burning magnesium, it didn't burn, it exploded. The rapid thermal expansion shattered its frozen cells instantly. A chain reaction. I didn't stay to watch the fireworks. I slammed the inner airlock wheel, spinning it shut just as a frost-covered hand jammed into the gap. The fingers were hard as stone. I kicked the arm, hearing the bone snap with a dry crunch, and forced the wheel down. The seal hissed. Safe. For now. I slumped against the cold metal of the outer door, gasping for air, the vapor of my breath clouding the small space. I checked my pack. The food was there. The hard drive was there. But as I looked at my glove, I saw it. A smear of that blue, iridescent fluid from the door handle. It wasn't soaking in, it was sitting there, shimmering. I frantically wiped it off with a disinfectant wipe, scrubbing until the material of the glove nearly frayed. The evolution of the virus changed everything. We thought winter was our ally, that the cold slowed them down, preserved us. We were wrong. The cold was their forge. I pushed the outer door open, stumbling back out into the raging blizzard. The screaming wind felt different now. It didn't feel like a barrier. It felt like their hunting ground. I adjusted my pack, gripped my rifle, and vanished into the white, carrying the weight of a haul that would keep me alive. And the knowledge that would likely keep me awake for the rest of my life. The wind didn't just blow, it stripped. It was a physical weight. A grinding force of ice and particulate matter that scoured the goggles of my thermal mask until the world was nothing but a blur of static gray. My Geiger counter clicked rhythmically, a slow, dying heartbeat against the howling gale, confirming that the radiation levels were low enough to survive, provided the cold didn't stop my heart first. The silhouette of the facility materialized out of the whiteout like a tombstone. It was brutalist architecture, sharp angles of concrete and reinforced steel, half buried in the encroaching permafrost. The sign, scoured almost clean of paint, read Borealis Initiative Sector 4. This was it. The rumors whispered over shortwave radios by dying men were true. I reached the airlock, my fingers numb despite the layers of wool and Gore-Tex. The manual override wheel was frozen solid, a rusted iron donut coated in 3 inches of rime ice. I had to use the crowbar, wedging the steel tongue into the mechanism and heaving with every ounce of caloric energy I had left. With a shriek of tearing metal that sounded like a gunshot in the void, the wheel turned. The hydraulic seal broke with a hiss of escaping pressure, breathing out a cloud of stale, recycled air that smelled of ozone and ancient copper. I slipped inside, forcing the heavy door shut behind me, sealing out the roar of the tundra. The silence that followed was heavier than the storm. It was the silence of a grave. I clicked on my tactical light, the beam cutting through the dust motes suspended in the freezing air. The lobby was a wreckage of overturned desks and shattered security monitors. This hadn't been an evacuation. It had been a slaughter. I moved to the security kiosk first, scavenging instinct taking over. Check the bodies, check the drawers. The guard slumped in the chair was little more than a desiccated husk, the dry cold having mummified him rather than rotting him. I patted down the tactical vest. 2 magazines of 5.56mm ammunition, precious gold. A half-empty energy flask. And a keycard, dangling from a lanyard around a neck that snapped like a dry twig when I lifted it. I moved deeper, the beam of my light dancing over the walls. Scorch marks. Bullet holes at head height. They had fought hard here. I bypassed the elevators, death traps and a power outage, and found the stairwell. The descent into the belly of the facility was a journey into the throat of the beast. Down here, the temperature actually dropped. Usually, subterranean levels are warmer, insulated by the earth. But the air creeping up the stairs bit at my exposed skin. It felt unnatural. Chemical. Level B3, Cryogenetics and Virology. I used the crowbar to pry the magnetic locks on the door, the metal groaning in protest. The hallway beyond was lined with observation windows. I wiped the condensation from the first glass pane and froze. Inside the room, strapped to a gurney, was one of them. But it was wrong. It wasn't the shambling, rotting sacks of meat I was used to fighting in the cities. This thing had changed. The skin had turned a translucent blue-gray, pulled taut over the bones. But the most terrifying detail was the crystallization. Sharp, jagged protrusions of biological ice, or something that looked like ice, erupted from its shoulders and chest. It looked like the virus had weaponized the cold, turning the host's fluids into a natural armor. I moved into the lab proper, stepping over shattered beakers and piles of paperwork. I needed answers. I needed to know if this was an anomaly or the future. I found a terminal in the main office that still hummed with emergency reserve power. I jacked in my portable drive, praying the encryption keys I'd scavenged from the main server months ago would work. The screen flickered green. Access granted? I scanned the logs, my eyes widening as I read. Project Zero Kelvin. They weren't trying to cure the wildfire virus here. They were trying to adapt it. They wanted a soldier that could fight in Arctic conditions without gear. They exposed the infected to extreme sub-zero temperatures and pumped them full of experimental coagulants. The log dated November 14 stood out. Subject 88 shows complete cessation of necrotic decay. The virus has entered a symbiotic state with the freezing temperatures. Instead of the host freezing to death, the pathogen utilizes the ice crystals to reinforce the skeletal structure. The subject is no longer dead tissue. It is a cold fusion battery of rage. A crash from the back of the lab made me spin around, rifle raised. The silence shattered. In the far corner, a containment tube had ruptured. Liquid nitrogen fog spilled out across the floor, swirling around heavy, wet footsteps. Out of the fog it emerged. It stood nearly 7 feet tall, its silhouette bulked out by the crystalline growths on its shoulders and forearms. It didn't moan. It made a sound like cracking glaciers, a deep, resonant clicking in its throat. I fired, a double tap to the chest. The bullets sparked. They didn't penetrate. They ricocheted off the frozen carapace covering its torso. The thing didn't even flinch. It lunged with terrifying speed, not the slow shuffle of the walkers. It moved like a piston. I dove over a lab bench, hearing the screech of metal as the creature swiped through the steel table I had been standing behind a second ago. I needed a headshot, but its skull was encased in a helmet of that same translucent bone ice. I scrambled back, my boots slipping on the slick floor tiles. I saw a rack of chemicals, industrial solvents, flammable accelerants. I grabbed a beaker of ethanol and a flare from my belt. The creature roared, a sound of tearing wind, and charged. I threw the beaker. It shattered against the creature's chest, dousing the icy armor in high-grade alcohol. I popped the flare and tossed it. The reaction was instant. The blue flame engulfed the creature. The thermal shock was the key. The ice armor wasn't just hard. It was brittle under rapid temperature change. As the fire licked at the crystals, they began to crack and pop loud enough to burst eardrums. The creature screamed, a human sound, buried under layers of mutation, and thrashed blindly. I leveled my rifle, waiting for the opening. The heat caused the faceplate of ice to fracture, revealing the raw, preserved flesh beneath. I took the shot. The bullet passed through the compromised armor and exited the back of the skull. The thing collapsed, hitting the floor with the weight of a statue. I didn't wait to see if it twitched. I grabbed a heavy medical box from the counter, broad-spectrum antibiotics, adrenaline injectors, surgical tools, and the hard drive. I ran. I ran back up the stairs, my lungs burning, the weight of the scavenged gear cutting into my shoulders. When I burst back out into the airlock and cracked the seal to the outside world, the wind hit me again. But this time, the cold felt different. It wasn't just the weather anymore. As I looked out over the endless white tundra, I realized the snow wasn't burying the infection. It was preserving it. Evolving it. The cities might belong to the dead, but the frozen wastes belonged to something much worse. I adjusted my pack, checked my compass, and began the long trek south. I had the data, but I carried the knowledge that the winter was no longer our ally. It was an incubator. The hydraulic hiss of the airlock ceiling behind me severed the howling wind of the tundra, replacing nature's scream with a silence so absolute it made my ears ring. The temperature inside the vestibule wasn't much better than the whiteout outside. But at least the wind chill couldn't strip the flesh from my bones here. I adjusted the straps of my rucksack, the nylon stiff and crinkling in the sub-zero air, and checked the Geiger counter clipped to my chest. Silence. No radiation. Just the bitter cold and the dust of a facility that had gone dark 3 years ago. The placard on the heavy blast door ahead read Boris Initiative Sector 4, the letters faded and scratched. I gripped my pry bar, my gloves thick and clumsy, and jammed the tip into the seal of the inner door. With a groan of rusted metal and straining muscle, I forced it open just enough to slip through. The interior was a tomb of brushed steel and shatterproof glass. Emergency lighting pulsed in a slow, rhythmic decay, a heartbeat of dying amber every 6 seconds. In those brief flashes, I saw the aftermath. The lobby wasn't chaotic like the cities. There were no barricades of furniture or desperate graffiti. It was clinical. Bodies lay in orderly rows near the reception desk, preserved perfectly by the cold. They weren't torn apart, they had slumped where they stood or sat. I approached the nearest one, a security guard still clutching a P-90 submachine gun. His skin was a translucent blue-gray, pulled tight against the skull, his eyes frosted over like cracked marbles. I didn't touch him. I just took the P-90, checked the magazine, full, and slid it into my harness. Scavenging the dead in a freezer is easier than in the heat. No rot, no smell, just the unsettling preservation of the moment they died. I moved deeper, sweeping the flashlight beam across the floor. My objective was the sub-level labs, but survival demanded I check the logistics wing first. I needed calories. The cafeteria was a cavernous space of overturned tables and spilled trays. The food on the plates was frozen rock-hard, fossilized meals interrupted by the end of the world. I ignored the trays and vaulted the serving counter, heading for the pantry. The heavy steel door was locked, but the electronic mag lock had failed when the main power died. Inside, it was a gold mine. Cans of peaches, vacuum-sealed tuna, freeze-dried trekking meals. I loaded my pack methodically, prioritizing protein and fats. The weight on my back increased, a comforting burden. I found a box of thermal batteries on a shelf near the back, the kind used for high-end field equipment. I swapped the dying cells in my flashlight and the optical sight on my rifle. The beam cut through the darkness with renewed intensity, revealing something I had missed in the dim light. Scratched into the stainless steel of the pantry wall, clearly done with the tip of a knife, were words: "The cold does not kill it. It slows it. It hardens it." A shiver that had nothing to do with the temperature rattled my spine. I left the pantry, weapon raised. The facility wasn't just a tomb. It was a containment vessel that had failed. I made my way to the elevators, prying the doors open to reveal the empty shaft. The cables vanished into the black abyss below. I rappelled down, the friction of the rope heating my gloves, my breath pluming in front of my face like dragon smoke. Level B3, Virology and Containment. The air here tasted different, metallic, recycled, stale. The amber emergency lights didn't reach this deep. It was pitch black. As I navigated the corridors, I began to see the evolution. The bodies here weren't peaceful. The glass walls of the observation rooms were smeared with dried, black fluid, blood that had frozen and sublimated over years. Inside the labs, the scientists hadn't just died. They had been torn open, but not for consumption. It looked like they had burst from the inside. I found a terminal in the head researcher's office that still had a faint charge from an uninterruptible power supply. I bypassed the admin lock, standard factory defaults, the arrogance of geniuses, and accessed the final logs. The screen flickered, text scrolling in green phosphorescence. Subject 84 exhibits unique adaptation to cryogenic stasis. The pathogen creates a hyperviscous biological antifreeze, replacing the host's blood plasma. Crystallization of the dermis observed. Bullet resistance increased by 300%. Warning: host retains motor function at -40 degrees. Dormancy is deceptive. I heard the sound then. It wasn't the wet, shuffling footfalls of the rotters back in the cities. It was a sharp, clicking sound. Like ice cracking on a frozen lake. Asterisk click. Click. Slide. Asterisk. I killed the flashlight. The darkness rushed in, absolute and suffocating. I crouched behind a lab bench, clutching the P90, my breathing shallow. The clicking grew louder. In the hallway outside the office, a silhouette passed across the faint luminescence of a keypad. It was humanoid, but wrong. It didn't hunch. It stood rigid. Its movements were jerky, mechanical, lacking the fluid grace of a living human or the drunken stumble of a ghoul. It turned its head, and the faint light caught its face. The skin was gone, or rather, it had transformed. The face was a mask of faceted, crystalline growth. The eyes were gone, replaced by sunken pits of shadow. It sniffed the air, and the sound was like a vacuum seal breaking. It could smell the heat of my body. It turned toward the office door. I didn't wait. I raised the P90 and fired a 3-round burst. The noise was deafening in the confined space. The bullet struck the creature's chest, but there was no spray of blood, no tearing of rotten meat. Sparks flew. The rounds ricocheted off the frozen, hardened torso with the sound of hammers hitting an anvil. The creature didn't stumble. It shrieked, a high-pitched, resonant frequency that vibrated in my teeth, and charged. I rolled over the desk as it crashed through the heavy oak, its limbs thrashing with terrifying strength. It was fast, unburdened by pain or shock. I switched to my rifle, a higher caliber, aiming for the legs. I fired, the recoil digging into my shoulder. The .308 round shattered the knee joint, blowing out a spray of blue, slushy fluid. The creature collapsed, one leg severed at the shin, but it didn't stop. It began to crawl, its fingers, long, blackened claws of frostbitten bone, gouging deep furrows into the linoleum floor. "Hardens it," I whispered the warning from the pantry. The virus had turned them into organic tanks. I backed up, fumbling for a flare on my belt. Heat. If cold was their armor, heat was the weakness. I cracked the flare, the magnesium sparking into a blinding red brilliance, and tossed it at the crawling nightmare. As the flare hit the pool of blue sludge leaking from its leg, the liquid hissed and boiled instantly. The creature thrashed, screeching as the heat compromised the structural integrity of its frozen flesh. The crystal armor on its face began to crack and weep. I stepped forward, the heat of the flare searing my face, and emptied the rest of the P90 magazine into the creature's head at point-blank range. The combined thermal shock and ballistic impact finally did the job. The skull shattered like a dropped vase, fragments of bone and eyes skittering across the floor. Silence returned, heavier than before. I stood over the carcass, panting, the adrenaline sour in my mouth. I knelt to examine the remains. The tissue wasn't flesh anymore. It was a composite of frozen muscle and viral resin. This was the evolution. The virus had learned that to survive the endless winter, it had to become the winter. It had abandoned the need for warmth and embraced the 0 point. I looked at the shattered lab around me. There were dozens of containment cells in this sector. Hundreds of staff members. And I had barely survived one. I scrambled to the terminal, downloading the data to a portable drive. The cure wasn't here. I knew that now. This place was a monument to failure. But the data on the mutation, on the hyperviscous strain, that was currency. That was survival. I packed the drive, grabbed a box of medical injectors from a smashed cabinet, and headed for the emergency stairwell. The elevator shaft was too exposed. As I pushed into the stairwell, I looked down the spiral of concrete. Below me, on the landings of B4 and B5, I saw them. Faint, blue bioluminescence pulsing in the dark. Hundreds of them. Standing still. Waiting. They weren't dead. They were hibernating. And I had just rung the dinner bell. I began to climb, forcing my exhausted legs to piston up the stairs. The clicking started below me, a cascade of cracking ice that grew into a roar of movement. They were climbing too. I burst through the door to the ground floor, my lungs burning in the frigid air, and slammed the heavy blast door shut, spinning the locking wheel until my tendons popped. A second later, a heavy thud shook the door. Then another. They were hammering against the steel, a rhythmic pounding that vibrated through the floorboards. I didn't stop. I sprinted for the airlock, the loot on my back bouncing, the data drive burning a hole in my pocket. I hit the release, the outer door cycling open to the blinding white tundra. The wind hit me like a physical blow, but I welcomed it. I stepped out into the storm, the endless white void. Behind me, the facility was waking up. The infection hadn't died in the cold. It had been forged by it. The hydraulic seal of the blast door groaned, a sound like a dying wail echoing across the infinite white expanse of the tundra behind me. With a final, metallic thud, the heavy steel slab locked into place, severing the howling wind outside. The silence that followed was heavy, pressurized, and tasted of stale recycled air and copper. I stood in the decontamination airlock of Facility 34B, shivering not just from the ambient 0-degree temperature, but from the adrenaline crash. My breath plumed before me in the beam of my tactical light, the only source of illumination in the pitch-black vestibule. I checked my Geiger counter. The needle remained steady. No radiation. Just biological threats. I gripped the pry bar in my left hand and my suppressed pistol in the right, stepping over the threshold into the facility proper. The reception area was a tomb of glass and chrome, perfectly preserved by the cold. It wasn't like the cities, where looting and riots had left scars of fire and debris. This place had died quietly. A security guard sat behind the front desk, head tipped back, mouth agape in a silent scream. I approached cautiously, weapon trained on his chest. His skin wasn't gray or green. It was a translucent blue-white, pulled tight against the bone like shrink wrap. The frost had mummified him. I reached over the counter, my fingers numb despite my gloves, and patted down his vest. 2 spare magazines of 9mm, jackpot. I pocketed them, the brass clinking softly, a noise that sounded like a gunshot in the oppression of the quiet. I also found a keycard dangling from his belt. Access level 3. It would get me past the lobby at least. I moved deeper, the beam of my light cutting through the suspension of dust and ice crystals floating in the stagnant air. The hallway led to the residential wing. Survival meant scavenging, and I needed calories before I could tackle the labs below. I breached the first door on the left, a dorm room. The bed was unmade, sheets frozen in a tangle. I rifled through the lockers. Nothing but uniforms and personal photos, the smiling faces of the dead mocking my desperation. The second room, however, yielded a treasure, a hidden stash under a bunk. 3 MREs, military grade, and a half-empty bottle of bourbon. I tore open one of the ration packs immediately, shoving dry crackers and cold jalapeno cheese spread into my mouth, not caring about the taste. The fuel hit my stomach like a lead weight, but my hands stopped shaking. As I ate, I noticed the scratches on the walls. They weren't the frantic, chaotic claw marks of the early infected. These were rhythmic, precise gouges in the steel paneling. Deep, parallel lines. Whatever made them had strength far beyond a human, and claws that could shear metal. I swallowed the last of the cracker and raised my gun. The infection out here. It was different. I had heard rumors on the shortwave radio before the batteries died, whispers about the cold strain. The virus, usually dormant in extreme cold, hadn't just survived here, it had adapted. It used the host's body as an incubator, changing the physiology to withstand the freeze. I pushed toward the freight elevator, but the shaft was frozen solid. The stairwell was the only option. I descended into the darkness, the metal grating of the stairs creaking under my boots. Level B1, Research and Containment. The air grew colder here, a biting chill that bypassed my parka and settled in my marrow. The smell changed, too. Gone was the sterile scent of the lobby, replaced by a pungent, chemical odor, ammonia and something sweet, like rotting flowers preserved in syrup. I reached the landing and swiped the keycard. The reader flashed red, then green, struggling on reserve power. The door hissed open. The lab was a nightmare of shattered glass and overturned equipment. But it was the specimens that stopped me cold. Rows of containment tubes lined the walls. Most were broken, the liquid drained, but a few remained intact. Inside, floating in viscous, green-tinted suspension fluid, were the subjects. They weren't just shamblers. Their limbs were elongated, joints swollen and reinforced with calcified growths that looked like armored plating. Their fingers had fused into three-pronged talons. I stepped closer to a desk, sweeping the light over a scattered pile of logbooks. I picked one up, the pages stiff and brittle. Subject 89 exhibits hyperaggressive cellular regeneration in sub-zero environments, the messy scrawl read. The pathogen has synthesized a natural antifreeze protein in the blood. Viscosity is increasing. The subject is no longer responding to necrotic decay. Instead, the virus is reinforcing the skeletal structure. They are evolving armor. A sound from the back of the lab froze my heart. A wet, clicking noise. Like dry bones snapping together. I killed my light instantly, plunging the room into absolute darkness. I crouched behind a heavy lab bench, controlling my breathing, listening. The clicking came closer. It wasn't the dragging shuffle of a zombie. It was the tapping of hard claws on linoleum. Fast. Twitchy. I peered over the edge of the bench, activating the red filter on my flashlight to preserve my night vision and minimize the signature. 10 meters away, something was perched on top of a centrifuge. It was humanoid, but wrong. Its skin was jet black, slick with an oily secretion that I realized must be the biological antifreeze. It had no eyes, just smooth, pale skin where the sockets should be, but its ears were flared and twitching. It was hunting by sound. It was hunting by thermal regulation. It could probably smell the heat radiating off me. I needed to move. I needed the samples in the cold storage at the back of the room. High-grade antibiotics and viral suppressors that could buy me another year of life. The creature cocked its head, letting out a low, chittering hiss. It dropped from the centrifuge, landing on all fours with silent grace. It was an apex predator, forged in the ice. I spotted a fire extinguisher on the wall 5 meters to my right. If I could cause a distraction. I unclipped a flare from my belt. The striker cap twisted off with a tiny snap. The creature's head snapped toward me instantly. I threw the flare down the hallway behind me. It erupted in blinding red light and sizzling heat. The creature shrieked, a sound that vibrated in my teeth, and launched itself toward the heat source. The thermal signature of the flare was brighter than me. I sprinted. I didn't try to be quiet. I bolted for the cold storage vault at the far end of the lab. I heard the creature realize its mistake, the screech of claws on the floor as it turned, but I was already sliding through the vault doors. I slammed the locking mechanism. A split second later, a heavy impact shuddered through the steel door, denting the metal inward. Then another. And another. It was trying to carve its way in. I was trapped, but I was in the motherlode. The shelves were stocked with pristine medical supplies. Syringes of adrenaline, broad-spectrum antibiotics, morphine, and experimental retrovirals. I frantically loaded my pack, stuffing every crevice with glass vials and sealed boxes. This loot was worth more than gold. It was life. The pounding on the door stopped. Silence returned. But I knew it wasn't gone. It was waiting. Or worse, it was fetching the others. I looked around the vault, and saw a ventilation grate near the floor. Tight, claustrophobic, but it led away from the door. I kicked the grate open and squeezed inside, dragging my pack behind me. The metal was freezing against my stomach as I crawled. I could hear them now, not just one, but dozens of them, chittering in the lab I had just fled. They were waking up. The facility wasn't abandoned, it was a hive. And I had just rung the dinner bell. As I shimmied through the dark, narrow tunnel, I realized the terrifying truth of the evolution. The infection didn't just want to spread anymore. It wanted to survive. And in this frozen hell, it had built an army to do just that. The hydraulic hiss of the airlock was the loudest sound I had heard in weeks, cutting through the eternal howling gale of the tundra outside like a guillotine. As the heavy steel door sealed behind me, the pressure equalized with a popping sensation in my ears, leaving me in a silence so profound it felt heavy, pressing against my temples. The interior of the Epsilon 9 biohazard facility wasn't just cold, it was a tomb preserved in liquid nitrogen. The emergency lighting had long since failed, leaving my tactical flashlight to carve a narrow tunnel of illumination through the suffocating gloom of the decontamination chamber. I checked my Geiger counter, green. I checked the atmospheric sensors, breathable, though stale enough to taste like copper and dust. I cracked the seal of my helmet, the air rushing in with a smell that wasn't rot, but something sterile and chemical, like ozone and bleach frozen in time. My primary objective was scavenging, but survival instincts screamed at me to keep a weapon raised. The hallway ahead was lined with shattered glass and overturned gurneys. Unlike the chaotic ruin of the cities, where looting was a frantic smash and grab, this place required surgical precision. I moved to the nearest reception desk, prying open drawers frozen shut by moisture that had iced over years ago. My gloved fingers brushed past useless paperwork to find the prizes. A half-dozen sealed blister packs of broad-spectrum antibiotics and a box of lithium batteries. Gold dust. I shoved them into my pack, the crinkle of the plastic echoing sharply down the corridor. The bodies here were different. In the city, the dead were picked clean or decomposed into unrecognizable sludge. Here, the extreme cold had mummified them. Staff members in white coats sat slumped against walls, their skin turning a translucent blue-gray, preserved in the exact moment of their death. But a closer inspection of a corpse near the security checkpoint made me pause. The man's throat had been torn out, standard zombie fare, but the wound edges were jagged, ossified. I leaned in, my light playing over the injury. The dried blood wasn't black, it was a shimmering, viscous purple. And where the infection had spread before death, the veins didn't just darken, they bulged, reinforced by some kind of subdermal lattice. I pushed deeper, descending into the belly of the facility via a service stairwell, as the elevators were dead tombs hanging in their shafts. Level B2, Pathology. This was where the loot would be. I forced the pry bar into the jamb of a secure storage room, the metal shrieking in protest before the lock snapped. Inside, it was a scavenger's paradise. Shelves lined with untouched medical supplies. I swept armfuls of sterile bandages, suture kits, and adrenaline injectors into my duffel bag. I found a crate of MREs, the Menu 14 label promising a calorie count that could keep me moving for 2 days per pack. But amidst the looting, the narrative of the lab began to unfold on the scatter of clipboards and abandoned tablets. I picked up a tablet that still held a fraction of a charge. The screen flickered, displaying the final logs of a Dr. Eris Thorne. The timestamp was 3 years post-outbreak. They hadn't died when the world fell, they had continued working. I scrolled through the text, my breath hitching as I read. Subject 82 shows unexpected adaptation to cryogenic stress. The pathogen is not dormant at sub-zero temperatures as predicted. Instead, it is rewriting the host's metabolic processes. It is generating an endothermic reaction at a cellular level. The virus is evolving to heat the host from the inside out to maintain mobility in the tundra. I lowered the tablet, the cold sudden feeling much more dangerous. We had assumed the winter was our ally, that the zombies froze solid like anyone else. But here, in the dark, the science said otherwise. The infection was engineering a way to hunt in the snow. I needed to reach the main containment lab on level B3. If they had synthesized a cure, or even a weaponized strain I could use, it would be there. The air grew colder as I descended, the frost on the walls growing into thick, jagged spikes. The silence broke. A wet, rhythmic thumping echoed from the darkness ahead. It sounded like a heartbeat, slow and heavy. I killed my flashlight, switching to the grainy green of my night vision monocular. The hallway to the main lab was coated in a thick, organic resin. It looked like ice, but it was sticky, smelling of ammonia. I stepped carefully, avoiding the patches where the resin had pooled. The evolution wasn't just internal heat. The virus was excreting a protective layer, an organic insulation. I reached the observation deck overlooking the central containment pit. The reinforced glass was spiderwebbed with cracks, smeared with that same purple ichor I'd seen upstairs. Below, in the pit, the chaotic evolution of the virus was laid bare. There were bodies down there, but they weren't human anymore. They were hulking masses of calcified muscle and bone. The virus had gone into overdrive, compensating for the cold by thickening the skin into armored plates. forcing bone spurs through the flesh to act as natural crampons for ice traction. And they were moving. Not the shambling, mindless drift of the urban infected. These things paced. They were hunting. I spotted a heavy-duty transport case on a desk inside the observation room, the alpha sample label glinting in the ambient light filtering from the snow-covered skylights far above. I moved toward it, my boots crunching softly on broken glass. The sound was slight, but in the acoustic perfection of the lab, it was a thunderclap. Below me, the pacing stopped. A shriek tore through the air, high-pitched and vibrating with a frequency that rattled my teeth. It wasn't a vocal cord scream. It was the sound of air being forced through a mutated spiracle. I grabbed the case, the weight of it reassuring, and turned to bolt. The glass of the observation deck exploded inward. One of the specimens had scaled the sheer concrete wall of the pit with impossible speed. It landed amidst the shower of safety glass, a nightmare of pale, chitinous armor and steaming flesh. Heat radiated from it in waves, distorting the air. Its eyes were gone, replaced by sensory pits along its skull, thermal hunters. It sensed my body heat against the background of the frozen lab. I didn't hesitate. I raised my shotgun and fired a slug directly into its chest. The impact staggered it, cracking the boneplate armor, but didn't drop it. The creature roared, a spray of hot, acidic blood hitting the floor and hissing. I scrambled back, overturning a heavy metal desk to create a barrier. The creature lunged, its claws shredding the steel like wet cardboard. This was the evolution, apex predators designed for the wasteland. I pulled the pin on an incendiary grenade, my last resort, and rolled it under the desk. I dove through the doorway just as the blast detonated. The heat washed over me, a momentary reprieve from the biting cold, followed by the wet tearing sound of the creature screeching in agony. I didn't look back. I sprinted up the service stairs, lungs burning, the weight of the loot and the sample case dragging at my shoulders. Reaching the lobby, I slammed the stairwell door and jammed the pry bar through the handles. Thuds impacted the door seconds later, denting the metal. They were fast. Terrifyingly fast. I scrambled into the airlock, hitting the cycle button with a frantic fist. As the heavy door began to slide shut, I saw the stairwell door buckle, the metal tearing open. A pale, steaming hand reached through, grasping at the empty air of the lobby just as the airlock sealed. The hiss of pressurization was the sweetest sound I'd ever heard. I stumbled out into the blinding white of the tundra, the wind instantly freezing the sweat on my face. I had the supplies. I had the data. But as I looked out at the endless expanse of white, the victory felt hollow. The cold wasn't going to save us. The virus had learned to conquer the ice. And now, I knew what was waiting for us in the winter.